Welcome to the first in a fortnight of fantasy deep dives. We're talking past performances, usage trends, depth charts, salary caps, coaching changes, snap counts, and so much more. So grab that scuba suit as we dive deep into the AFC East on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Our rankings are on our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. And of course, you should be liking and subscribing on YouTube as well. This is our first in a series of fantasy deep dives. I wanted an opportunity to go into a lot more detail and a lot of fantasy prospects. And I felt the best way to do that was on a team by team basis. So I'm basically going to be looking into a division every 2 days over the next fortnight, assuming I can fit it all in and get it all done in time. That's the plan anyway. See how it all goes. So today we're talking about the AFC East. I'm going to be going into a whole heap of detail, talking coaching changes, player changes, usage, what happened last year, what we should expect from this year. I think it's going to be really interesting, and I hope you'll come along for the ride with us. If you've got ideas of extra stuff you want us to talk about in this series, please make sure you go to the comments below and tell us what you'd like to see. Let's get into it. So we're kicking things off talking about the Buffalo Bills, and they were very good last year. In fact, they've been very good for a number of years. Obviously, they've been a consistent playoff team, getting double-digit wins every single season. Sean McDermott's done a really good job with this team, but there are changes elsewhere. Joe Brady comes in in his first year as their OC. He hasn't been an OC since back in 2021. Admittedly, he was their OC later in the season, last season. So he kind of knows what's going on and we kind of know what to expect. But this is his first full year in charge, and I expect we will see some changes. They've also got Bobby Babbage coming across as their DC. So it's going to be really interesting to see if McDermott can keep the train rolling with new coordinators in both positions. They were excellent on both sides of the ball last year. 6th most points scored, 4th fewest points conceded. Had a few issues with turnovers, but they were mostly very good. As you'd expect with any offense with Josh Allen, they are very run heavy, but of course that includes a lot of Allen's runs. That's always going to affect your receivers, which is why for the most part, we haven't really seen them have a lot of receivers and tight ends that have been fantasy successful at the same time. And I expect that's probably going to continue. The good thing about the Bills for fantasy is they've got a really high play rate. They're generally a team that tends to be pretty aggressive in a lot of situations. And we know from how Joe Brady operated with the Panthers a few years ago that he also had a lot of plays per game. And he was pretty neutral in passing percentage with them as well. He's already come out and said very clearly, this is Josh Allen's offense. We want to get the ball into his hands. We want to get him running this offense. And that's really good for Allen for fantasy, but it's also going to help a lot of the pass catches as well and should keep this offense humming. Now, they do have a lot of experience on their roster, but they've also got a lot of dead cap with the Stephon Diggs trade. So it's going to be interesting to see if that affects their ability to consistently bring in talent. They're giving their top salaries at the moment to, unsurprisingly, their quarterback, but also a whole lot of aging defensive players like Von Miller and Matt Milano. Now, you do expect to see a lot of older players getting the highest salaries because a lot of the younger players are still on their rookie contracts, but that is a little bit concerning for the long term, especially because their guys on longer contracts are a lot of their older players and also their kicker, which is a little bit random as well. They have brought in a lot of good young players for fantasy. Obviously, we've got Ray Davis and Keon Coleman being the main guys, but I think Curtis Samuel's going to have a big role in this offense as well. We'll get into that into a little bit. And you can also see for the most part, their losses haven't been major outside of Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis. So it's going to be a case of seeing whether they can replace those pass-catching options with the slew of veterans that they've brought in. So let's have a look at the quarterback position first. So Josh Allen is obviously the number one guy here, and they have made a few changes in that they've brought in an actual backup in Mitchell Trubisky, who we know is actually a pretty good quarterback when you're talking about backup starters. He's better than most of the backups in the league, and it gives them a little bit of reassurance that this year, if something happens to Allen with how much he runs, that's always possible, they at least have a viable backup. And that should give you a little bit more confidence when drafting the wide receivers and tight ends in this offense, because we know that Trubisky is at least capable of keeping the offense going. Now, we saw with his tendencies last year with Josh Allen that he tends to run the ball a lot, and he tends to be willing to check down and keep it pretty short a significant amount of the time. 45% short passes is a pretty high rate, and it's a little bit surprising when you think of guys like Gabe Davis as being a deep target, and Khalil Shakir had plenty of deep targets as well last year. So it's a bit surprising that he has such a short tendency to his passing last year, and he wasn't as good passing short as he was deep. We think of Josh Allen as being a guy with a big arm. They weren't really using that enough last year. So I think it'd be interesting to see if we see a little bit more of that sort of thing from the likes of Khalil Shakir, maybe a bit of Keon Coleman, but also Marcus Valdes-Scantling comes in. I would expect that he gets some deep targets as well. Hopefully that means a few more passing yards from Josh Allen to kind of supplement the rushing totals that he always gives you. Having said that, didn't hurt him last year. He was still the number one quarterback in fantasy in 4-point touchdown leagues. He had a very good season last season. His completion rate was solid, a lot of passing yards. He does throw a lot of interceptions, and you should keep that in mind if you're in a league where you get heavily penalized for interceptions. There are going to be some leagues where you're only getting 4 or 5 points for a passing touchdown, but you're giving up 3-4 points for an interception. If that's your situation, Allen's a guy that you want to drop a little bit lower. It also depends on how you're rating passing touchdowns. 29 passing touchdowns isn't a lot for an elite tight end. It's those rushing touchdowns that make the big difference. If you're getting 6 points for a rushing touchdown and 4 points for a passing touchdown, all of a sudden, Allen becomes significantly more valuable. If you're in a 6-point passing touchdown league, suddenly you have to think about maybe whether you want to be moving Josh Allen down your rankings a little bit. Be interesting to see what happens with Joe Brady, how they change this offense. I think this is going to be a space to watch, especially in the preseason, to see if we see anything new and hear anything out of training camp. Now, they've also made some changes to the running backs. They've gotten out a lot of the aging veterans like Latavius Murray and Leonard Fournette, and they've brought in a guy who I actually think is going to be really good in Ray Davis. I think he's a very talented running back. I think he's got some upside here, and it wouldn't surprise me if he gets a surprisingly high amount of snaps. The projected depth chart on the right there is just my perception based on the snap counts they were getting last season and the roles I can see these players going into this season. I expect that James Cook is probably good for fantasy again, but I don't see another top 12 finish. I expect he will do a lot of the heavy lifting between the 20s. He can be explosive. He's a solid receiver, so I think they're going to use him here. But Ray Davis will be really good on the goal line, and he's a solid receiving back as well. Guys don't often get that many receptions in college. College players tend to get a lot of rushing yards and not a lot of receptions unless they're truly a receiving guy. So that gives a lot of confidence that Ray Davis might be able to do a little of that receiving work. Hopefully for James Cook owners, he's taking that off guys like Ty Johnson rather than taking it off James Cook. But it wouldn't surprise me if he's out on a lot of the third downs as well moving forward. That's going to depend a lot on his ability to pass block, and we've still got to see how that holds up in the NFL. But I have a lot of confidence in Davis as being one of the rookies I like as kind of like a late round guy, even in redraft leagues this year. Now, Ty Johnson comes in as the third guy. He's not someone you need on fantasy rosters because even if the top two guys get injured, realistically, he's more of a passing downs guy. We probably see an ugly committee and they probably bring in a veteran like a Leonard Fournette, like a Latavius Murray, one of the guys that we've seen there before to do a lot of the heavy lifting up front while Johnson does a lot of the receiving work there. So it's really James Cook and Ray Davis. Cook takes a little bit of a dent because of Davis coming in, but we could still see Cook being very good. These rankings, by the way, are my dynasty rankings. Obviously, for redraft, Davis is going to be a little bit further back. It's hard to know exactly where to put Cook for now, but at the moment, I've got him just outside that top 12. Now, the wide receiver room is where things have changed a lot, and there's a lot of mixed feelings about Keon Coleman. I'm extremely high on him compared to the consensus. He's my wide receiver 4 among rookies, and he's my wide receiver 19 overall. This is a really good wide receiver class. There is a big drop off after the top 3, but for me, Coleman goes into clearly the best situation. Look at the other guys on that depth chart. Curtis Samuel has been good at times, but he's mainly an around this line of scrimmage short pass kind of guy. They're going to want to get the ball in his hands and let him do things with the ball. But realistically, this is Keon Coleman's wide receiver room, and Samuel's going to be a bit of a do-it-all guy. I do think there's upside there with Samuel. The reason he's ranked quite low, he's not very young. He's not going to be around for a whole lot longer. We don't know exactly how he's going to be used here. It is possible that he'll split snaps with quite a few other slot guys they got there. There's a lot of people talking about Keon Coleman being the big slot guy. That's not going to happen. He didn't have a lot of slot snaps in college, and most of the other guys in this depth chart are slot receivers. Curtis Samuel spends most of his time in the slot. Khalil Shakir was in the slot a lot last year, though I think potentially that's because Diggs and Gabe Davis don't go there a lot. Marquez Valdez-Scantling is more of a slot guy as well. They also put Hardy there occasionally for little trick plays. So there's a whole lot of slot receivers on this offense. They need the big outside guy. That's going to be Coleman. He's taking over either that X role, the big Z role on the outside. And I think that can be pretty productive if Joe Brady uses him effectively. Obviously, the tight ends are also going to get involved here heavily as well. And that's why we don't know exactly how the snaps are going to pan out. I would expect we see quite a few 3 wide receiver sets, but not as much as some teams because they're going to want to put Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox out there at the same time quite often as well. So that's going to affect somebody's snaps, and it's hard to know exactly who. A lot of teams will have 100% snaps for their top receiver, and that's the kind of players you want. It's hard to know if Coleman's going to get there or not. It's going to be down to his pass blocking more than anything else. But I do think he's going to be out there most of the time. Curtis Samuel and Khalil Shakir, they could be up towards 100% depending on who gets that wide receiver 2 role and who's coming off the field when they put those other guys on. I'm a little bit concerned about how they're going to use Marquez Valdez-Scantling. If they bring him on a little bit more in that slot role because he offers something a little bit different, it could be that Shakir's coming off, and that's going to be a little bit of an issue for Shakir's value. We're talking about a day 3 guy, even though he was impressive at times last year. It's hard to know if he was just impressive because they didn't have any other guys, or if he was legitimately impressive. It's easy to look good with Josh Allen. So we've got to see what happens this year. That's why I've got Shakir ranked quite low. I'm a little bit concerned about his snap share this year. Now, a lot of people have been talking about Chase Claypool turning up. Chase Claypool's turned up at a whole lot of places over the last year or two. Nothing particularly productive has happened at any point in time. So I wouldn't be particularly excited about him. He's not someone I'm going out of my way of getting. Realistically, in most leagues, he shouldn't be rostered. The same is true about anyone from about 5 downwards. I think Valdez-Scantling is the only one of interest because if there's an injury, he's naturally the next guy who steps in. I still don't think he'd be particularly productive, but if you're in a deep league, he might offer you something. Everyone from there downwards is a little bit useless fantasy-wise. Now, the tight ends is where things are going to be really interesting. Dalton Kincaid started to take over last season, but when Dawson Knox returned from injury, Kincaid's snaps did drop a little bit. When Knox was injured, Kincaid was out there on 60 to 90% of snaps, but when Knox returned from injury, his snap count dropped to closer to 40 to 60% depending on the week. Now, we don't know what's going to happen this season, but traditionally with rookie tight ends, they are kept off the field as they improve their blocking and understand the offense a little bit better. We would expect that snap count will rise as we move forward, but I think at least early in the season, he's probably going to be capped about 2/3 of the snaps. That's not ideal for fantasy, but we're talking about a true receiving tight end. Brock Bowers comes in and gets a lot of the plaudits, but Dalton Kincaid was that guy last year. Last year, we talked about how good this tight end class was as receivers. And while Sam Laporta's been the main guy that's been talked about from a fantasy perspective of late, realistically, it was Dalton Kincaid who was expected to be the best prospect coming out of college from a pass catching perspective. The Bills was an ugly landing spot, but they've got to understand the talent they have, and they've got to transition towards using him a little bit more. So I would expect that he's going to build forward. He still managed to be a top 12 tight end last season just by staying healthy, and he really did eat while Knox was injured. I expect that he slowly starts to take over after a while. Though Dawson Knox also isn't going anywhere. I mean, hopefully he gets traded, but I think realistically he's probably going to hang around for a little while yet. So I would expect that we're still going to see a little bit of Knox, but more so as a bit of a blocking tight end than just a supplementary tight end. There's nothing really below those guys. We saw when Knox was injured, Quinton Morris was the guy who came in. I don't expect him to be particularly productive at all, even if Knox or Kincaid goes down. I think if one goes down, it just really benefits the other one. So there are some situations where it makes sense to bring Dawson Knox onto your roster in deeper dynasty leagues because you know if Kincaid has an injury all of a sudden you've got a guy capable of being a top 12 tight end. I think that means he's the kind of guy that fits into that kind of Isaiah Likely category of being nearly a handcuffed tight end. So I'm interested in Knox for that reason. But Kincaid's a guy I'm really targeting. If I can get my hands on Kincaid owners and try to show them his usage late in the season, potentially you can convince them to trade him cheap to you. And that would be fantastic because his usage is slowly going to grow as the season goes on. Let's move on to the Miami Dolphins. So the Dolphins obviously have been growing over the last few years. They obviously had quite a few years where they were tanking, essentially. I think that's essentially been confirmed now. But they've been slowly building and they've had winning seasons the last 4 seasons, playoffs the last 2 seasons. Mike McDaniel's done a really good job with the team. He's combined well with Frank Smith, and I think we're going to expect a similar offense this year. And it was an offense that was fantastic for fantasy. They do bring in a new DC, but that should not realistically hamper the offense too much. The only concern is going to be that they conceded the 22nd fewest points last season, which is another way of saying the 11th most. For that reason, potentially if the DC improves things and Weaver can get things going a little bit, that might mean the offense doesn't need to score as many points. Having said that, there were games where they're just piling on the points for fun. So it is entirely possible they'll just keep attacking anyway. And that's just how this offense is built. And that's what you've got to hope as a fantasy owner. Weaver hasn't been a DC for a while as well. So it's also possible they totally bust. And that would also be good for the offense, assuming that the defense can keep teams off the field enough for the offense to have time in possession. They're pretty pass neutral, and I expect that to happen. The problem is with their passing touchdowns. They tend to go to their running backs a lot, and we saw that because it made Raheem Mostert a top 3 tight end last season. We also saw Achane breaking off a lot of massive long runs and getting plenty of touchdowns that way. So it is hard to know exactly what to expect from that perspective. They're also pretty slow from a play pace perspective, and that's a little bit concerning if their offense isn't able to be as explosive as it was this year. Having said that, I do expect that we continue to see something very similar in the way that they play, passing a lot of the time, but then getting into the red zone and doing quite a lot of running the ball. Hopefully, maybe the extra red zone targets they've brought in are going to make a positive difference. We'll talk about those guys soon. But when you think about additions like Odell Beckham Jr., Jonnu Smith, you're talking about guys who could receive the ball in the red zone and offer that extra weapon. That's probably going to help Tua Tagovailoa. Now, and I do know how to say his name. It just didn't come out of my mouth correctly. Now, the roster is aging a little bit, but you tend to expect that with teams that are challenging because they're not trying to rebuild. They're not bringing in a whole lot of use. They've still got plenty of cap space if they need to bring anybody in. Top salaries at the moment going to guys like Tyreek and Tua, and that's a good sign because you want your best players getting the most salary. So when you talk about your wide receivers and Tua getting salaries, fantastic for the offense, fantastic for the passing offense, and also solid defensive players as well. Guys like Waddle and Hill are going to hang around for a little while now, and that's really positive. I also like the fact that Hill said he's going to retire in the next couple of seasons, but that just allows Waddle to take over. I think that they're building something here that can work with any pace players they put in. So I think they've at least got a system and they know how to use it, and that's going to be good for Tua's value long-term and Waddle's value long-term as well. Their losses this season are really minor. It's basically their depth wide receivers. They didn't really have a wide receiver 3 last season. It was essentially Braxton Berrios in there for half the snaps, and they kind of cycled guys through that other spot. They didn't use a lot of 2 tight end sets. It was mostly 11 personnel. They did bring Alec Ingold in occasionally, but for the most part, it was 3 wide receivers, but it wasn't always the same wide receiver 3. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Now they've removed a lot of their wide receiver 3 options, like Cedric Wilson. We won't talk about Chase Claypool, but Robbie Chosen, those guys, they were getting touches last year. I think that this season, most of that goes to Odell Beckham Jr., but you'll have to hang around for the wide receiver section to see exactly how I expect that to pan out. Let's talk about Tua first. He was solid last year without being spectacular. He did have a top 10 season, but I think he was really helped by a lot of players having injuries around him. The biggest concern with Tua from a long-term fantasy perspective is we don't know that he's actually going to be able to stay healthy long-term. There have been a lot of concussion concerns around him. Anytime that happens, that means with the wrong knock, this guy could be out indefinitely. He could be gone for the rest of his career, which is a really sad possibility, but it is something that can happen, and it's more likely to happen with players with concussion issues. It's just like if you've got a player that's got a long-term history of hamstring injuries in the other running positions, you have to understand that that's going to happen more often. And if it does happen, it's going to last longer. It might be hard to come back for. The same thing happens with Tua. So that's why I've ranked him lower, not because I don't like him as a player. I really like him as a player, and not because I don't think he's going to be good this year, because I think he probably will. I'm just concerned in the long term that there is that possibility of injury, which means that he could have less longevity than a lot of the other players who are in his position and are producing similar amounts. He has been injured for 3 of the last 4 seasons. It was really only last season that he finally managed to play 17 games. That doesn't mean he's suddenly guaranteed to keep playing 17 games. He's not necessarily injury prone, but he's an injury risk. And we have to understand that one healthy season doesn't actually change that. So last season, he was pretty good, but he did throw quite a few touchdowns. It's just the nature of the way that he plays. He doesn't run the ball a lot. He's more of a pocket passer, and they have improved their O-line a little bit, but it's still a little bit of an issue, and that increases his injury risk as well. He does go long a little bit more than guys like, say, Josh Allen, and he's still very accurate deep, and that is helped a lot by the fact that he's got 2 excellent deep receivers, particularly Tyreek Hill. If you're throwing to Tyreek Hill and he's 3 or 4 meters open, it's pretty easy to get a good passer rating because you just have to get it into that general region. So that's inflated a little bit like that. But we are talking about a guy who is a very good passing quarterback, and you expect he's going to continue to be good long term. They've just got to keep him healthy and upright. Nothing particularly interesting about their tendencies other than the fact that we do expect quite a lot of deep passes, and they do go behind the line of scrimmage a little bit with a whole little trick plays. A little bit concerned about their backups. Mike White has been okay in spot usage, but he's not the best quarterback too. So it's hard to know exactly how much to trust him. They had him last year as well. I was hoping they'd bring in someone a little bit better, and that would give me a little bit more confidence in Hill and Waddle. But, I mean, White's okay. He can do a job, and he's at least aggressive, which is good when you're talking about wide receivers and tight ends. You want an aggressive, positive quarterback. Now, their running back room is where it gets really interesting because it was really effective last year. Raheem Mostert was fantastic. He's a guy that I've liked for a while, but I don't think anyone saw this sort of breakout coming, especially because he's in his 30s, so it's pretty crazy. It's hard to know how much longer he can do it for. He had a couple of seasons where he was just constantly injured. He's finally managed to get healthy the last couple of years, and he's looked really effective. He's not much of a receiving back, but they got more receiving usage out of him than San Francisco ever did. And they got a lot of touchdown usage out of him. He was ripping touchdowns from everywhere because he's got that speed, but they use him a lot in the red zone, and that's fantastic for a running back. The interesting thing is going to be what happens once he retires. Do they transfer that on to Achane, who's essentially the best back in this backfield? Does it go to Jalen Wright? Does it go to somebody else? Do they want to have 3 running backs used consistently? These are all things you need to consider when you're valuing these players. I do expect that Mostert will be good for another season or 2, but it really only takes one injury to knock an older running back out for good. Most older running backs, when they have any sort of injury, will find it really hard to bounce back. So it's going to be all about staying healthy for Mostert. If he can't, I don't know that Achane's the kind of guy that can handle a heavy workload. I think that's why they brought in Jalen Wright. They need that injury security. They got away with it last season because Mostert was mostly healthy. But when he wasn't healthy, it was a bit awkward. They were using Jeff Wilson. They're using Salvon Ahmed. Ahmed was even 3rd on the depth chart at one stage, which is scary. I think they've realized these guys aren't guys you want to particularly see on the field. They're not reliable options. Jeff Wilson's getting older. Ahmed is just not that good from an NFL perspective. So for that reason, I think they've brought in Wright as more of a backup for now and someone they can develop long term. He's a quick player. He's an average receiving back, but I think he's probably going to end up having more receiving chops than Mostert does. Having said that, Achane was a really good receiving back in college. So it wouldn't really surprise me if they get him involved in that even a little bit more. He needs to work on his pass blocking a little bit, but I think if he can get that all sorted out, he could be really effective pass catching back as well. So I think we're going to see pretty much equal snaps from Mostert and Achane this season. The question is how they use them. I think potentially they start to dial down Mostert's running snaps just slightly. A little bit more from Achane in the red zone would really help him, but I think it's probably going to stay Mostert's job for now until someone can actually prove that they deserve that opportunity. So Mostert's probably the guy to own in fantasy this year, but Achane has way more upside than pretty much anyone else you can find. If for whatever reason Mostert gets injured and Wright just isn't quite good enough, you're going to see Achane get a lot of very high value touches. You've seen what he can do in a few amount of touches. Imagine what he can do with a lot of touches. Now, to be fair, We said that about Tony Pollard last season. And explosive players sometimes get run down by getting too many touches in the wrong situations. So you've got to hope that they're at least giving Achane touches in the right situations, but we really want to see him take over in the red zone. So a few more red zone touches to Achane would really help his value. It'll hurt Mostert, and it's going to be interesting to see how Wright's involved here. I think this is a backfield to watch, especially in the preseason. Now, the wide receiver rooms also had some changes, but not with the top two guys. We know how good Hill can be. We know how good Waddle can be. Now, Hill has talked about retirement. He said at the end of this current contract, he's thinking retirement. So that means 2, maybe 3 more seasons. It's a bit of a concern. I was on the Walter Football show the other day, and we talked about players who have this tendency to, once they know they're going to retire, they kind of take one foot out and they start to become a little bit of a weaker player in that last season. I expect we might see that with Darren Waller this year, but we've seen it with a lot of players in the past. I think that could happen with Tyreek Hill. He's somebody who isn't desperate to keep playing. I think once he's made the decision, he's probably going to be just pretty much out, and he might not be great for that final season. So that's something to keep in mind. He's someone in fantasy you probably want to think about selling while he's hot. Unless you're really challenging for a title right now in Dynasty, he's someone you can sell. Having had him have 2 top 2 seasons the last 2 years, he's still quite young, but he's not going to be around for as long as players of his age. So you can point to guys like Devontae Adams and Amari Cooper and stuff like that playing into their 30s. But realistically, I don't know that Hill's going to do that. And he's someone that you probably want to cash out on right now, unless you're challenging right now. You want to be challenging in the next season or 2. Otherwise, there's no point having him on your roster. Waddle's a guy who I think will eventually take over for him. He's got to stay healthy, but when he's been healthy, he's been pretty effective. Hill being so good hurt Waddle a little bit. The biggest thing that hurt Waddle was the effectiveness of the running back. The running backs were so good. They just didn't need to use their other wide receiver. It also really doesn't help that he had, 5 touchdowns, whereas Hill had a heap of touchdowns and the running backs had even more than that. So even though this offense is getting a lot of touchdowns, they're not really going to Waddle. So you hope that over the long term, that's going to shift towards him and that keeps his fantasy value, but there is some risk there. I think the third wide receiver slot here will continue to be a little bit of a rotation. I think probably when they want that guy to go to the outside, it's probably OBJ. I think Beckham probably plays the outside role. We saw a little bit of like River Craycraft doing that last year, Cedric Wilson. I think Beckham probably does that and does it more effectively. I think they also use him a lot more in the red zone because he is so good in the red zone. On the other hand, Braxton Berrios is the guy when they need someone to slide into the slot. They use Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle in the slot a lot. In fact, they often use 2 wide receivers in the slot and just move things around so that they can keep things unpredictable for the offense. So for that reason, I think we'll see Berrios used a little bit less. They can rely on Beckham on the outside, keep getting Hill and Waddle into the slot. I think they prefer to do things this way, but I would still expect Berrios to be out there on about a third of the snaps, roughly, depending on what happens and depending on how good OBJ looks. OBJ actually isn't that much older. Just those injuries have really sapped a lot from him. It'll be interesting to see how he goes with a full offseason and now in a legitimately competitive team who actually wants to use him potentially as well. They did bring in a couple of rookies in Malik Washington and Taj Washington. They're just 7th round guys. And if you saw my wide receiver hit rate video, and a lot of you did, and thank you for the support on that, realistically, 7th rounders bust a lot of the time. I believe they have a 98% bust rate over the last 10, 15 years. The 2 that didn't bust were Russell Gage and Noah Brown, who aren't exactly fantasy superstars. So it's hard to see a lot coming out of Malik or Taj Washington, especially when we didn't even get much out of Eric Ezukanwa. There's no way I pronounced that correctly. But we didn't get much out of EE. So I don't expect we're going to get much out of guys that were drafted a whole lot later. I think these are like special teams guys, bit part guys. We hope that something will happen with them. I actually really quite liked Malik Washington coming out, but that draft position is awkward, even though this is a team that could use him effectively if they can put him in that right role because of his speed. Tight ends. This has been a nothing spot for Miami for a while now. But they do bring in Jonnu Smith, who's actually been sneakily good for a while now. He was solid in New England before he fell off and Hunter Henry took over that role. He then kind of goes across to Atlanta and kind of displaces Kyle Pitts a little bit. And he did have some really good play at times. It was mostly checkdowns. They weren't really using him very aggressively down the seam, and that's a bit of a concern. But we saw them use Durham Smythe a similar way. Look at how low those yards per reception totals are for both of those guys. Anything below 10 is pretty low even for a tight end. So we're talking about check down tight ends, and that's how they want to use him. Smith does get a lot of his targets in the red zone, and that's fantastic for fantasy, but he only got 2 touchdowns last season, which is a little bit odd. Hopefully, they get a few more to him with the Dolphins. You don't really want to use those short guys in the red zone unless you're using them speed to get open. So having some big bodies there is really going to help. I think OBJ makes a big difference, but I do expect Janu Smith is also involved in the red zone too. That at least makes him someone you can roster because he does have upside. We've seen he's had 3 top 20 tight end finishes over the last 5 years, and that gives him value. Durham Smythe was someone who looked okay at times last season. I had him rostered in a couple of really deep leagues, for example. And he looked okay actually in the playoffs, but realistically, Janu Smith comes in. I don't think he's someone you can roster in any leagues now, not even in 32 team leagues. I mean, a couple of them, I'm just going to drop him. So he's not someone I'm particularly interested in. He more gives you an understanding of how the usage is going to be for Janu Smith. And that's reasonable usage without as many targets. But I think you'll probably get more targets, but it's the type of usage, that check down usage, that red zone usage. I think that's what we see from Smith. They don't really have much behind either of these two guys. Julian Smith was technically the tight end 2 last season. He had one big game when Smythe was unexpectedly injured. He was still active, but injured. And Hill came in, and I was a little bit excited because I was like, well, this is interesting. This is someone new. But I think they realized very quickly that that's not going to happen. So I think Jody Fortson's the only other guy who would come in as a pass catching guy. We saw him do that a little bit with the Chiefs, but he was pretty useless at that as well. So I think probably all the tight ends below here are the guys you don't particularly want. I think Smith's the only guy of interest. Now, the Patriots have been excellent for a long time, and we finally saw them take a dive over the last season or two. They finally started to lose a lot of games. They ended up with a 3rd overall pick after a real dud of a season. That unsurprisingly led to Bill Belichick moving on. I don't know whether that was an overreaction, but I think if you're going to go into a rebuild, it makes sense to bring in a new head coach. I think Jared Mayo's been fed to the wolves a little bit here. There's a lot of talk that they're expecting good results here. That's not going to happen. We're talking about a team who was 31st in points scored last season. Their defense has been good for a long time, but now they've got this defensive-minded head coach who wasn't even the DC last season. They've got a new DC as well in DeMarcus Covington. I think it's all going to be pretty ugly. Alex Van Pelt is a good get. He was good with Cleveland the last few seasons. Interestingly, with Cleveland, they were actually 1st in plays per game last season. Now, I don't know if that was just because of how Joe Flacco coming in and how they changed the offense when Nick Chubb was injured. I think that might have something to do with it because that really boosted their passing percentage. They went from bottom 10 to kind of mid-range. It's hard to know what they'll do here, but you'd have to think that if you're Alex Van Pelt and you're looking at what the Patriots have and you think, who are our best players? Well, it's not the receivers. You've got one good pass-catching tight end, and you've got a rookie quarterback or a veteran backup quarterback that's in there temporarily. You've got to go to Ramondre Stevenson initially, surely. You've got him and Antonio Gibson, who've both had some really good fantasy seasons and some really good NFL seasons. I think you've got to get as few plays per game by doing it that way. And that really concerns me because while Van Pelt had a lot of plays per game last season, I think he'll really want to slow it down and try to rely on the defense to keep the offense off the field as much as possible. We saw they had a really terrible turnover ratio last season. They couldn't score properly. They were trying to pass because they were chasing games and it wasn't working. It's hard to know exactly what to expect here, but it's pretty ugly. I think they're probably still rebuilding. Now, they do it the most cap space of all teams. When I calculate cap space, I use SpotTrack and I use their top 51 cap space, which is basically when all their starting players are getting paid, how much are we talking when they've gotten all the guys off the roster that they're not going to keep into the season. And that was positive. They still got they've got very little dead cap space as well, but they do have quite a few aging players from when they were good. And they used to take on a lot of veterans. So it's a little bit of a mixed roster. I think they probably need another year of rebuilding. And it makes sense when you look at the top salaries. We're not talking about excellent players here. Jonathan Jones is average. Matt Judon is good, but he's getting a lot older now. Godshow's fine, but Juju Smith-Schuster getting paid a lot of money and still on the roster is a little bit weird. They do have some young guys with longer contracts coming through, like Barmore's an excellent player who just got paid and deservedly so. Christian Gonzalez has looked good as a rookie. like Henry and Bourne were surprisingly good, but they gave way too much money to Kyle Duggar, for example. So I think this is all a little bit of a mess, and that's really concerning for fantasy because you don't want to be trying to get players in a team where they're not going anywhere. Even though you look at the talent they brought in, there's quite a lot of positive talent. Brissett's a totally functional starting quarterback. He's not fantastic, but he can get the ball out there enough. Antonio Gibson has been very good at times over the last few years, even though he was disappointing last season. Jalen Polk's a guy that I like quite a lot, even though I forgot to talk about him in the wide receiver hit rate video I talked about. Javon Baker's a guy that a lot of people like. I don't. I don't think he's going to be heavily involved. We'll talk about that in a second. And if you look at the guys they've lost, mostly aging guys, which is positive. Mac Jones turned out to be a little bit of a bust. Ezekiel Elliott, obviously aging and looked pretty washed last year. Javonte Parker's literally retired. Mike Gesicki was disappointing. So the guys they're getting used to, the guys they're getting rid of are guys you can afford to get rid of. And the guys they're bringing in have some talent. So I think they're doing the right things, but I expect this is a team that's going to be good a year down the track, 2 years down the track rather than right now. And I don't know that Jared May is necessarily going to be around to see that happen. It wouldn't surprise me if they struggle a bit this year again, bring in someone new, and then things start to click a little bit. And that would be good for fantasy because you don't really particularly want a defensive-minded head coach for fantasy in general, even though I think Alex Van Pelt can call a pretty aggressive offense if he has the right players. Let's talk about the guy who's probably going to have the ball most of the time, Drake May. Now, to be fair, I do think it's possible Jacoby Brissett starts the season as the starting quarterback. It really depends on how far they think May has developed. There have been quite a few concerns about May as being NFL ready, and that's fine. The Patriots aren't NFL ready. They're going to struggle anyway. Struggling is actually going to be good. It's not good for Robert Kraft, who's realistically probably doesn't have a long time with us. Sorry, Robert. And therefore kind of wants to win now while he can enjoy it and also kind of say like, hey, this is me. I did this. This wasn't just Bill Belichick. This wasn't just Tom Brady. I was a part of this, and I can have success without those two guys. So it makes sense for him to want to get involved and try to win soon, but I don't think it's going to happen this year. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see some Brissett. I don't think he's going to make it through a whole season, although I do think that would be better for Drake May if he had a whole season to kind of develop in that Patrick Mahomes model of sitting behind, in his case, Alex Smith, in this case, Jacoby Brissett, learning, developing, and then coming out and looking good the next season. Drake May in college showed a really good deep arm throw, and he was a good scrambler. What does that sound like? Well, we're talking Josh Allen here. We're talking about big arm. We're talking about good scrambling, pretty big guy. The upside's there. So he's someone that you can like in fantasy, but because of everything else going on, he has been dropping a lot in drafts. For me, he's a very clear QB3, and a lot of people don't see it that way when we're talking about rookies. And I actually like him a lot in Dynasty as well. QB17 is higher than most people have him. I think there's plenty of upside here. I'd be happy taking him earlier if you're willing to wait a season or two. The reason a lot of people are a bit squeamish on him is because they don't know if he's going to play straight away. But when he plays, he's got so much more upside than all the other guys. Look at my QB hit rates video if you want to know just how much safer it is to have a top 3 quarterback than the guy who was taken in those picks later on. He does throw a few interceptions because he's a little bit more aggressive than someone like Jaden Daniels, but he's also going to offer you enough with his legs to give you a floor that can make up for that. So I really like Drake May as a fantasy option. I think he needs to improve his short area passing, but he offers enough that I think that you should be aggressive in trying to get him. If you're doing a rebuild, this is the kind of guy you want to get your hands on. I wouldn't be relying on a JJ McCarthy. I'd want someone like a Drake May. Maybe a Michael Penix is like a Drake May diet version or something like that. But May's the guy that I'd much prefer if I can't get my hands on those top 2 quarterbacks who are going to cost a whole lot more. May's someone you can get in the second round of rookie drafts. Now, the running back room's where things are going to be really interesting. I don't really trust how they're going to use Antonio Gibson. It's hard to know exactly what to expect. It could be that he just steps into that Zeke snap percentage, but not exactly the same Zeke role. I do expect that he's probably going to get some receiving work. He is a converted wide receiver. At least they tried to do some wide receiving stuff with him. He does get plenty of receptions and didn't get enough rushes last year. Wouldn't surprise me if he goes into a similar role, but Stevenson can do that too. He's a solid receiving back, and he's a big back who can be used in the red zone. So I'm not sure exactly what they're planning on with Gibson, but the good news is that unlike Zeke, if Stevenson gets injured, Gibson's someone that can come in and actually be effective. He's got 2 top 12 fantasy finishes to his name in the last 4 years. He's still someone that we can think of as having a little bit of upside. it's just hard to feel really good about the number 2 back in this offense. There's not going to be as much scoring as in a lot of teams. And we saw that. Stevenson only had 4 touchdowns last year. And admittedly, Zeke took quite a few of them, and he did miss some games as well due to injury. But I don't know. When this offense is good, having this running game is really useful, but this offense isn't good at the moment. So I'm not really sure that you want to be relying on either of these guys. I think Stevenson has a lot of upside purely based on the touches and based on the talent. And I think long-term in a season or two, he's going to be really good. I just don't know whether he's going to still be there and whether Antonio Gibson's going to still be there. So it's hard to know exactly where to put your chips here. I personally wouldn't be going all in on this situation, but I like these guys a lot better than any other part of this offense because this is the part they're actually going to use. We've seen Van Pelt be really effective with a good running attack in Cleveland. If he can do it here with the Patriots, who should, on paper, be a good running attack with this talent, although the O-line's a little bit weaker, I do think that could be positive. I don't particularly want anyone behind them. Kevin Harris is someone that I think we all had a little bit of hope for. He got some touches late on last season. He didn't look particularly great. I think he's very much just a backup style guy. We know what the other guys are. Jermichael Hasty, Keyshawn Vaughn. You don't want either of those guys. Wide receivers gets really interesting. They have a lot. Kind of like the Bills, heap of veteran wide receivers, quite a few young guys as well. For me, the number one guy is still Jalen Polk. I do think he comes in and he takes over that number 1 spot pretty quickly. He is a little bit of a deeper wide receiver threat. And I think that's good for someone like Drake May, who can put it deep. I don't know how he's going to go with Jacoby Brissett with that, though. I think he'll still be functional. We might see him do a little bit of closer stuff. He's solid from the slot, but there are plenty of other slot options here. I do think Demario Douglas is probably the primary slot option. I think KJ Osborne could come in and do that job a little bit as well. And we do see Kendrick Bourne go there occasionally as well. So I think Polk's just going to do that thing that a lot of number 1 receivers do, where they just go to the slot occasionally. And that's really good. That's good for value. You want to be someone that is able to play in the slot, and most good receivers can, but you also want to get your snaps out wide because otherwise you're going to be off the field too often. So I think that Polk is probably the number 1 guy here, and I'm cautiously optimistic about him. I think within 2 or 3 seasons, he could be really good, but he's not someone who's likely to be winning you your league this season. And that's concerning. In redraft, I don't want any part of it. In Dynasty, I like it as long as I'm not trying to win right now. Kendrick Bourne, on the other hand, has a little bit of upside if you are someone that's trying to win right now, because it wouldn't surprise me if he starts the year as their number 1 receiver. So in a really deep league, he can actually offer you some value. Problem is he hasn't been able to stay healthy, but when he has and he's on the field, he's actually been surprisingly good. So he's an interesting player. If you're like, within the next year, I reckon I might just take a punt on some guys from my bench who can potentially unexpectedly boom briefly. I think he falls into that category. I don't particularly like Demario Douglas in general. I think he was used a fair bit last season because they kind of needed to. They weren't getting enough out of everybody else. And they've got this young guy and they want to see what he can do. But I think he's very much the wide receiver 3 or worse. Wouldn't surprise me if he splits stats with KJ Osborne or even falls behind him. It's really hard to know exactly what they'll do with him, but I don't think he's going to be their top receiver in the long term, even if he gets some veteran snaps, despite the fact he's only a year 2 receiver early on. After that's a little bit of a mess. Not really sure how Javon Baker comes in. I think he could potentially be a reasonably effectively used backup. He might not get used at all. That's happened plenty of times. He could just be there as a special team, or he might not even make the starting squad. I know that'll disappoint a lot of people who've been taking him early, but realistically, day 3 wide receivers are very risky and they don't always hit, and they don't often hit realistically. So there is upside with Baker, but there's a lot of players on this roster who are perfectly good. Keep in mind, they're still paying $10 million to Juju Smith-Schuster to play this year. It's entirely possible he's ahead of Baker too. Jalen Reagor started at the end of last season. He could be involved. Taquan Thornton was a 2nd-round pick for them. He could potentially be involved. And they actually started to use Kayshon Boutte last season. We're talking about a lot of guys who were on an NFL field last season. I don't have a lot of hope that Baker's going to beat out all of them. I think he's probably going to be more of a backup guy, and he's going to have to earn it. Realistically, Polk, I like. Thorne, temporarily. Everyone else, not interested in pretty much every situation, unless you're getting Baker in like the late 3rd, early 4th round of a rookie draft, or getting him really super cheap. In redraft, I also wouldn't want Javon Baker. There's always going to be better players available. Tight ends are a little bit interesting because they got rid of Mike Gesicki and brought in Austin Hooper. Hunter Henry was getting a lot of snaps towards the end of last season. He was running a lot of routes too. He was out there nearly every snap, and that's fantastic for a tight end, but they didn't use him very effectively. He's also aging quite a bit. He's not the Hunter Henry we saw when he was a tight end one over 3 or 4 years at the Chargers and then early on in his Patriots career. So I think we're probably going to see another tight end 2 style season from him, but he will have some big games and he'll get some touchdowns occasionally. I think he probably deserves a little bit of touchdown regression. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that regress a little bit. But he also needs to be getting more red zone targets to make that happen. I think that's more likely now that you have Austin Hooper as his tight end too. Austin Hooper's more of a blocking tight end. He's a solid blocking tight end. He did have one good receiving season back in 2019, but realistically, we know what he is these days. He's going to be their tight end too. I expect he's out there about half the time because they're going to want to run the ball a lot and they're going to want their blocking tight end out there. Not really sure who their tight end 3 is at the moment. I really like Jaheim Bell, but he got drafted in the 7th round. 7th round tight ends, that nearly always means special teams or practice squad. So I don't have high hopes in him, but I put him in there as the guy I like third best from a fantasy perspective, even though on the depth chart, technically he's probably number 4. I think he could get up towards 40% snaps. We saw that happen last year with their third wide receiver options, depending on the situation. So it is entirely possible we see that again out of Bell. I think it's probably more likely to be Mitchell Wilcox, who's their other kind of squad guy, who's in the actual squad as opposed to likely to be in the practice squad, like guys like Petway was SoCal last season. So in that case, Wilcox becomes that blocking tight end, and that could open up things for Hunter Henry, but it could also open up things for Austin Hooper depending on how they use him. I still don't want Austin Hooper in fantasy. I think Bell's more likely to be the receiving tight end if Henry gets injured, but Hooper's going to be heavily involved as well. It's probably going to be a situation you want to avoid. So kind of talking myself out of anyone that's not Hunter Henry here, and not even particularly passionate on Hunter Henry, if I'm completely honest. Now, if you haven't worked it out already, I'm doing this all in alphabetical order. Not only alphabetical order in the divisions, but within the divisions as well. And it's just a coincidence that the least successful team in the league, the New York Jets, 5th most AFC East titles, congratulations, come up last. But I do like them as a chance of winning this division this year. Obviously, Aaron Rodgers being healthy will make a big difference, but they've also got Nathaniel Hackett coming back for his 2nd season. Robert Saleh's got a little bit more experience. They've brought in a lot of talent, but they've got to be better at the quarterback position. They haven't had a winning season in quite a long time now. They were 29th in points for, which is ugly as, but they didn't concede many points. Their defense is pretty strong. I really like what Jeff Ulbricht's doing there, and obviously Saleh's a very good defensive coach as well. So it makes sense they'd be very good defensively. And you can kind of see where they're paying their money. Guys like Quinnen Williams, DJ Reed, bringing in Hassan Reddick. We're talking about a lot of talented defensive players. Now, they have wasted some picks recently. It's really disappointing that they went for Will McDonald when they really wanted an offensive lineman and then kind of panicked. We saw he barely played last season, despite being the 15th pick overall in 2023, sorry. And then this season, instead of getting Brock Bowers or Rome Odunze, which they could have been a little bit aggressive to go up and get, or they could have just sticked and picked Bowers, they instead go and get an O-lineman who doesn't help them right now. They already have 2 starting O-linemen. So they've really hurt themselves there. And I think if they'd gotten that extra weapon, we might be thinking about them as a real Super Bowl contender. As it is, I'm a little bit concerned about that. Now, they were very pass-heavy last season, but that's mainly because they were often having to be. I don't think they particularly wanted to do it that way. It just kind of turned out that way. But they were often running in a lot of their touchdowns. So it's going to be interesting to see what that looks like this season. I expect the play speed picks up a little bit. They've got an aging roster, but that happens when you've got a 40-plus-year-old player playing quarterback. That's going to really bring that average up. Plus, they do have quite a few experienced players on defense as well. They've also got a lot of dead cap space, which isn't really what you want, and not a lot of actual cap space available. So that's a little bit concerning. They're not going to be able to easily bring in extra players. They've really gone all into this season, and I don't know that they've quite got enough because they've misused quite a few of their first-round assets recently. Now, if we look at the guys they brought in, I mean, it's good to have good backup quarterbacks, but realistically, if Aaron Rodgers is injured, you're not winning a Super Bowl with either of these guys anyway. Tyrod Taylor can kind of help you for a couple of weeks, and I think that's probably what they're hoping. They're thinking, well, if Rodgers is out for a week or two, we need someone who can back him up because it ain't Zach Wilson. So they brought in him. Plus, they're thinking long-term. They bring in Jordan Travis, who's realistically still injured. Until we see him healthy and actually playing, he's not someone you really need to think about, but he's a good future pick. with him being picked in the 5th round, I don't have a problem with that. I only have a problem with 1st and 2nd round picks being used on future prospects rather than thinking about winning now. Braylon Allen, and they also brought in Isaiah Davis as well. Brought in a lot of aggressive offensive talent. Mike Williams obviously comes in from free agency. They brought in Malaki Corley in the early third round. So there's plenty of talent here. We're talking about a lot of offensive weapons, and they didn't lose much. Look at the guys they're losing. They're mostly older players. Dalvin Cook, Randall Cobb. They were barely involved last season. CJ Uzama was basically phased out of the offense. Zach Wilson wasn't very good. Trevor Siemian probably even somewhat looked better than Zach Wilson at times over the last couple of years, but ultimately they're gone. They've brought in good replacements. They're moving in the right direction. We'll see how they go. Let's talk about how Aaron Rodgers is going to go and what we should expect. Now, firstly, no one is thinking about Aaron Rodgers in Dynasty unless you're trying to win right now. If you're trying to win right now, then yeah, absolutely go and get Rodgers if you're desperate. So I put up his redraft ranking because we're really only talking about the current season and what you can get out of Dynasty this year. So what are you getting out of the players this year? For me, he's around that QB 17 range. It's kind of like a quarterback too. I really don't think there's that much upside. He doesn't rush a lot, even though in 2022 he actually had nearly 100 yards. Doesn't get a lot of rushing touchdowns. Had a surprising amount of intercepts because he was starting to fall off a little bit towards the end of his career. He's coming back from a serious injury. It's hard to feel particularly good about him, even though I put in all his 2022 stats. They're still starting to look pretty ugly. Think about the PFF ratings, and thank you to PFF. Think about all the PFF ratings for the previous guys we've talked about here. We're talking about guys getting ranked in the 90s, and then we bring up Aaron Rodgers in the 70s. It's pretty ugly. Now, he's still good in that medium to long range, and he at least has some talented receivers to work with. And I think the fact that he's got better receivers this year will make a big difference. We know that was an issue outside Devontae Adams in Green Bay at times. So hopefully he won't feel the need to go as short as often, and he wasn't particularly effective short. And hopefully they can use him a little bit better on some deep passes and get this offense popping a little bit. Obviously, there's not a lot of quality in that depth, but I still think those players are going to be okay if they need to get into spot duty for a week or two, as long as it's Taylor and they're not relying on Jordan Travis. I'm not even sure he's going to be healthy. Now, the running back room is talented, but this is all about Breece Hall. Breece Hall looked good last year, and I expect he gets used even more this year because he wasn't healthy last year. We're talking about a guy who was coming off a serious injury, was barely playing early on in the season, still ended up 4th overall in fantasy. That's fantastic. He's a good receiving back. He's a fantastic running down back. Should have had over 1,000 yards. That was a little bit unlucky. He was used a bit ineffectively. I think they can find better ways of scheming him, but we're talking about a guy who should be fantastic in fantasy again. In most dynasty drafts, he's going off the board pretty early. I wouldn't be taking him as early as people are taking him because he's a running back, and running backs have less value in dynasty. But if you do want a good dynasty running back, if you're trying to win soon, then Breece Hall is a guy you can go out and trade for, get aggressive, go out and get, because he is going to be good for a few seasons. It is concerning they brought in both Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis, but realistically, I think they just realized they need better backups. Breece Hall has missed seasons due to injury. He didn't last season, but we saw what happened in 2022. They tried a whole heap of things with backup guys. They used Izzy Abanikanda a little bit. He wasn't particularly good, but I think they still keep him as a receiving down option. At times, they tried Michael Carter. Didn't work out with him. They basically threw a whole heap of things at the wall and it didn't work. So this time they've gone out and gotten some rookies. I think Braylon Allen's a pretty darn good player, but I don't think he's going to be anything but a backup guy. The only fear is that he's a bit of a bigger back. They could use him in the red zone, and that can be a little bit scary for Breece Hall owners. I hope that doesn't happen because Hall should be getting a lot of red zone touches, should be getting double-digit touchdowns, but Allen could come in and sneak a couple of those away from him. So that's a little bit concerning. Also, just wanted to throw a shout out to Tariq Cohen. Good to see him just back on practice squads. I don't think he's probably ever going to see an NFL field again, but I wanted to put him in there, even though he's not truly the tight end, the running back 5. I think that's probably Xavier and Valladay. But wanted to shout out Tariq Cohen because I was a big Tariq Cohen fan back in the day. Now, wide receivers, things get really interesting for the Jets. Obviously, Garrett Wilson is the number 1 guy. He struggled in his first 2 fantasy seasons because he didn't have a quarterback, and now he has Aaron Rodgers. We know that Aaron Rodgers can make fantasy gold out of pretty average players, Imagine what he can do with Garrett Wilson. We're talking about an extremely talented wide receiver. For me, talent-wise, definitely top 10, arguably top 5 receiver in the league, especially considering age. We're talking about a really good wide receiver. He just hasn't been getting the service. Now we finally get to Aaron Rodgers come in. I think he could be really effective. I think this is a top 10 season coming. That's why I'm taking him in the top 10 in Dynasty. The real fear there, though, what happens when Aaron Rodgers is gone in a season or two? Do they bring in someone good again? Do they go rebuild? What happens to Garrett Wilson? Does he have to go somewhere else? That is a little bit of a concern because we haven't really seen him produce with weaker quarterbacks as well as we would hope. Having said that, still had a 1,000-yard season last season, was still getting used well, and only had 3 passing touchdowns. And that's really saying something because he should see some regression there, and a lot of it with Aaron Rodgers. Now, Mike Williams is technically a wide receiver too at the moment, but he's very much a short-term option, and he hasn't been healthy for a long time. He missed a lot of last season, missed some of the season before as well. I've put his 2022 stats there, and you can see he still only played 13 games, played a lot less than that last season. Can he even get healthy? And if he can he stay healthy? That's the fear here because they don't have much at wide receiver. At least they brought in Corley, but they need Williams to be there as that wide receiver too. They need that big-bodied guy because they weren't getting that from someone like Allen Lazard last season. So they need to make it work with Williams. He can be a really effective player, but they need to use him properly and they need to keep him healthy. I'm not sure that they can do that. Corley kind of comes in as mainly a slot guy, but Wilson and Williams spend a lot of their time in the slot, so I'm not sure exactly how they're going to use Corley. I expect he's probably still a primary slot guy, and I expect they cycle him out a little bit with guys like Lazard, who Aaron Rodgers is still going to want involved. I don't think Gibson or Brownlee was good enough to really justify taking someone good off the field. So if Corley can be effective, I think he's probably still going to play a good amount of snaps, but he does have a lower floor than a lot of these other guys. It's going to be Wilson and Williams, and then there could be a big gap to Corley depending on how they use him. They did cycle in their weaker players a lot last year. Don't really want anyone below him. I mean, look, realistically, these guys weren't even particularly good when they were the wide receiver 2 last year. You don't want them now. Corley, on the other hand, is someone that I've got hope for, but he is someone that I put below a lot of the other third-round guys. He's below Jermaine Burton even. He's definitely below Roman Wilson. There's an argument around McMillan and McCaffrey. For me, I've got Corley higher. This is a situation where he could end up being the wide receiver 2, and Aaron Rodgers' wide receiver 2 is worth a whole lot more than Zach Wilson's wide receiver 2. So I think that Corley could potentially be good. He's someone that I'm interested in rookie drafts, but not ideally until the 3rd round potentially, or very late 2nd round, depending on how the wide receivers go. It's a really strong wide receiver class, so you can definitely do better. But if you're thinking later on, you're just wanting to add another guy on your bench who could potentially step up and be effective. I mean, we're talking about a 3rd round player, and that means something. Now, let's talk about the tight ends, and there's not really much here, except for the fact that Tyler Conklin just always stays healthy. Because he always stays healthy, he always plays 16 or 17 games, depending on how long the season is, and then he gets his top 20 fantasy finishes. He's not someone that you particularly want in fantasy at any point in time, and I don't particularly want him this season as well. That's why he's only my tight end 30. It's not because he's particularly old. For a tight end, he's okay, but I personally think that Jeremy Ruckett's going to start taking over a little bit. He's a talented tight end. He's a good blocking tight end, and he's an okay receiving tight end. I think we see a little bit more Ruckett this season, a little bit less Conklin. Plus, they've brought in some actual wide receivers, so Tyler Conklin is no longer the 2nd best receiving option. So I think that we're going to see less passing to Conklin, a little bit more Ruckett. That makes this whole situation a little bit messy. I think they also started to bring Kenny Yeboah in towards the end of last season. I would not be expecting much from him, but they do tend to use their 3rd tight end more than you would expect. So I think he or potentially Zach Kuntz, depending on what they end up doing, will be involved a little bit, but it's mainly going to be Conklin and Ruckett in some sort of committee where Conklin leads it, but it wouldn't surprise me if long-term Ruckett starts to take over. That means I don't want either of these guys in fantasy. There's just not a lot of hope there of anything productive happening in the long term. So that's all we've got for you today. This is the AFC East. Obviously, I'll be back tomorrow. If you know alphabetical order, you'll even know what division I'm bringing you tomorrow. If you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe. You can also check us out on Instagram at The Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and our website with all of my dynasty rankings and my rookie rankings that I talked about today is ffdfantasyfootball.com. If you're enjoying this format, but you want to see anything changed a little bit, let me know. because I still got to go through and work out a lot of this other stuff. I'm kind of doing it as I go. So I'm really looking forward to the next fortnight of fantasy deep dives on the Fantasy First Down.